by nothing but a single decision, and an innocent man was made the victim of that choice. Miss Marple trusted every word she spoke, but there was one truth that was more dangerous than anything else, a truth that only existed in her mind. If she didn't reach the truth in time, a web of lies would ensnare the world, but would time be on her side? Did she have enough of it to expose the truth, or would something unexpected happen, something no one had ever imagined? The storm had not merely come and gone that evening, it had prowled, whispered, and clawed at the leaded windows of Blackwood Manor, its relentless drumming against the glass like ghostly fingers demanding entry. Now, in its wake, an oppressive silence clung to the air, thick and suffocating, the kind that settles only when something deeply unnatural has occurred. The vast corridors of the manor lay heavy in shadow, the sconces flickering, hesitant against the consuming dark. Eleanor Graves, housemaid to Lord Alistair Blackwood, had never been one for superstitions or flights of fancy, but the moment she crossed the threshold of the study, her breath hitched, her pulse a cold, sharp thing in her throat. There, slumped grotesquely beside the grand mahogany desk, lay Lord Blackwood himself, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his vacant eyes fixed on something beyond the grave. A pool of crimson had seeped into the intricate weave of the Persian rug, a deep and ruinous stain, while a heavy brass candlestick, its surface slick with something dark and unmistakable, lay discarded mere inches from his outstretched fingers, as if wrenched from his grasp in his final futile struggle. The ornate clock on the desk had toppled, its delicate face shattered upon the floor, the fractured hands frozen at 8:15 p.m., a silent, unblinking witness to the horror that had unfolded. Eleanor could not move. Her fingers trembled, a strangled breath escaping her lips as the cold weight of realization pressed upon her chest. And then, as if her body had finally caught up with the horror her mind had already absorbed, she screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the manor's oppressive stillness like the shattering of glass. The echoes had barely begun to fade when hurried footsteps thundered along the corridors, urgent yet uneven, revealing more in their rhythm than any words could. The first to arrive was Julian Blackwood, the late lord's nephew and heir, a tall, sharp-featured man, whose usual air of indifference had been replaced with something unreadable, a flicker of calculation buried beneath feigned shock. Behind him Mrs. Langley, the stern-eyed housekeeper, materialized like a wraith from the shadows, her expression one of grim finality rather than surprise, as if she had seen too much of the world to be rattled by death. Others followed, the butler, his face set in stone, the young footman, shifting nervously at the doorway, and finally the village doctor summoned in haste, his coat still damp from the remnants of the storm. They stood in uneasy silence, each absorbing the scene in their own way, each crafting their own thoughts, some in horror, others in cold measured assessment. But Eleanor saw none of them, her gaze remained fixed upon the lifeless figure of Lord Blackwood, her lips quivering in a whisper only she could hear, "He's gone, he's really gone." Julian's eyes, dark and unreadable, did not leave his uncle's form. His voice, when it came, was steady, too steady. "Doctor, I believe you should confirm what we all already know." Dr. Ashford knelt beside the body, his fingers methodical as they pressed against cooling skin. A moment passed, heavy and unbearable, before he exhaled. "He's been dead for at least an hour," he murmured. Julian's expression did not change, save for a slow, measured blink. "Murder then," he said at last. Dr. Ashford's gaze flickered toward the bloodied candlestick, the grim confirmation unspoken yet absolute. By the time Constable Harris arrived, trailing in the imposing figure of Inspector Hale from Scotland Yard, the halls of Blackwood Manor were already thick with whispers. The village, small and insular, had wasted no time in stretching truth into tantalizing fiction. The murder of Lord Blackwood, a man both influential and deeply despised, setting off a wildfire of speculation. Over tea in her modest yet well-kept cottage, Miss Eugenia Forsyth listened with quiet intrigue to the breathless recounting of Mrs. Whitmore, the vicar's wife, whose recounting of the crime was embellished with the sort of dramatic flourishes that turned scandal into legend. They say, though you know how servants gossip, that his head was bashed quite terribly, blood everywhere, absolutely ruined that exquisite Persian rug, and poor Julian, standing there in such a state of shock. Though if you ask me, dear, he's always had a rather acquisitive nature. Miss Forsyth, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythmic succession, did not look up. Shocked, was he? She murmured. Oh, naturally, to find one's own uncle murdered in one's house, why it would unsettle even the steadiest of men. The old woman's lips curved ever so slightly, a knowing glint in her keen blue eyes. That would depend, she said softly, on whether he was truly surprised. There was a pause, a fraction of a second too long before Mrs. Whitmore let out a nervous little laugh. Oh, Miss Forsyth, you do have such a way with words. The elderly woman merely smiled, a kind and indulgent thing, but behind that smile, in the sharp depths of her gaze, the puzzle had already begun to take shape. By the time the first fragile light of dawn slowly unfurled over St. Mary Mead, the murder of Sir Geoffrey Poton had already worked its way into every conversation, from the rustic benches of the village green to the dim corners of the churchyard. What had once been a sleepy village, wrapped in the routine predictability of afternoon teas, quiet walks down moss-covered lanes, and long pauses during games of bridge, now buzzed with an undercurrent of strange, almost palpable energy. Whispers, thick with excitement and fear, darted from one mouth to the next, each version of the story changing in subtle ways with every retelling, growing wilder, more dramatic, as the hours passed. The villagers, always fond of a good mystery, had found their story. A murder of the wealthy and widely despised Sir Geoffrey was the kind of event that would keep them talking for weeks. At the Fox and Hound, the only pub that seemed to have retained any reputation, Mr. Elias Brooks, the butcher, leaned toward Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, his voice dropping low, thick with conjecture and malice. Bludgeoned, they say, he muttered, his words sounding more like an accusation than an observation. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as though the very walls might have ears. Blood all over that fine rug. Quite the mess, Mrs. Finch gasped, a gloved hand pressed to her chest, her voice faltering. Mr. Grayson, surely not. He's such a mild-mannered man, always so precise. Mild men have tempers too, Brooks retorted sharply, and his fingerprints were all over the weapon. Plain as day. Mrs. Finch's eyes widened, the words sinking in as the horror of the accusation began to take root. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, and she pressed her gloved hand tighter against her lips as though to keep back her own suspicions. Meanwhile, across the room, Miss Agatha Forsyth, the village's quietly observant widow, sat by the hearth, her hands steady as she poured tea from an ornate porcelain pot. Her eyes remained focused on the swirling steam, but her mind was already racing, considering angles that no one else could see. She knew better than to comment. She had been around long enough to recognize when a puzzle was unfolding, and right now the pieces were only beginning to fall into place. Constable Harper, who had never dealt with anything more complicated than a missing bicycle or a minor dispute over a garden hedge, stood awkwardly in Sir Geoffrey's study, notebook in hand, his face a study in confusion. Inspector Gray, a man whose career had been shaped by dealing with the messier aspects of life, stood beside him, eyes sharp and calculating as he took in every detail of the scene. No doubt about it, Gray muttered, his voice calm but filled with grim certainty. Flipping through his notes he continued, Grayson was last seen entering Ponton Manor at around 8 p.m., which fits with the timing of the murder. He gestured toward the shattered clock on the mantelpiece, its hands frozen at 8:15. The victim was struck at exactly 8:15, as the broken clock suggests. His gaze flicked over to the murder weapon, a solid brass candlestick, sitting neatly on the evidence table. Its ornate handle, once polished to a gleaming sheen, was now marred by deep red stains. "And here's the evidence," Gray said, his tone indifferent, but his eyes betraying the satisfaction of a case all but closed. "Fingerprints. All over it." Harper, ever eager to contribute, spoke up. "His fingerprints, Inspector. Right there, plain as day." Gray's gaze turned cold, as if the simplicity of the case was now closing in on Grayson. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the final verdict. At last, Gray sighed, a long drawn-out exhalation of air, and snapped his notebook shut. "All right," he muttered, "let's have him in." Albert Grayson, a man whose life had been one of careful order and gentle habits, was roused from his bed at an ungodly hour, his sleepy confusion evident as he was pulled from his modest cottage on the village's edge. He had barely had time to fasten his waistcoat before he was deposited in the cramped, unwelcoming sitting room of the local police station. Grayson's demeanor was one of discomfort, his slight figure hunched as though trying to shrink into himself, a man who had never been forced to face such scrutiny. He was a teacher, a man who liked his routines, who would never raise his voice or make a scene, and yet now, under the harsh scrutiny of Inspector Gray, he seemed too convenient, too innocent, but also too suspicious. Inspector Gray observed him with an intense focus, as though trying to discern the truth from the very fibers of his being. "Grayson," Gray began, his tone sharp but measured, "you were seen entering Ponton Manor at precisely 8 p.m. Yet no one saw you leave." Grayson's eyes flickered nervously, his body stiffening slightly as he considered his response. "Yes, Inspector," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "that is true, but I did not see Sir Geoffrey. I simply slipped a letter under his door and left." "And yet," Gray continued, "we found your fingerprints on the very candlestick that killed him." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Grayson's face. His hands, once neatly folded in his lap, now trembled slightly. He swallowed hard. "I don't understand," he whispered. "I never touched it." Harper, who had been standing at attention beside the fireplace, snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Yet, there they are, plain as anything." Grayson shook his head desperately, as though denying the evidence might somehow undo it. "I didn't touch it, I swear." The words were spoken with such intensity that Gray found himself pausing. Grayson's desperation was palpable, and yet something about it felt off. Gray had dealt with liars and criminals for years, and while Grayson was certainly shaken, his reaction felt strange. Not the panic of a guilty man, but the trembling disbelief of someone caught in a web far beyond their understanding. "Tell me again," Gray said slowly, his gaze narrowing. "You slipped a letter under Sir Geoffrey's door and left, and you never touched the candlestick." Grayson nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes, I swear it. I didn't do it." Gray exhaled sharply through his nose, his mind turning over the possibilities. It seemed too easy, too neat. And yet, there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, something about Grayson's fear, the vulnerability in his eyes, that didn't sit right. Could it be that Albert Grayson was truly innocent, or had the man found a way to hide his guilt beneath a carefully crafted exterior of mildness? As the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with fervent whispers, the arrest of Albert Grayson was the centerpiece of every conversation, drawing a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and a growing sense of dark intrigue. By noon, the village's streets were filled with murmurs of disbelief that the mild-mannered schoolteacher, the man who had never raised his voice beyond a polite murmur, could be capable of such a gruesome crime. The rumors swirled through the tea room, thick as smoke, with every villager offering a piece of speculation, their voices growing louder as they fed off one another's fears and excitement. Mrs. Finch, practically giddy with the scandal, leaned in, her eyes wide, clutching her teacup. "His fingerprints on the weapon," she whispered breathlessly. "What more could we possibly need?" Across from her, Miss Marple, calm as ever, smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking away in a steady rhythm. "One often needs quite a bit more," she murmured softly, her gaze drifting past Mrs. Finch, her thoughts already weaving into a complex web of questions. Mrs. Finch, caught up in the frenzy, rambled on, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, her eyes narrowing slightly as the first threads of doubt began to weave themselves into a dangerous pattern. The village had its story, but Miss Marple knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving, and as the trial approached, she found herself watching every move with an unsettling sense of foreboding. The courtroom at Melord Dezes was grand yet stifling, the oak-panelled walls casting a shadow over the proceedings, as if they themselves were holding their breath. Trials in the sleepy village were rare, and the entire town turned out to witness the spectacle. Albert Grayson, now standing in the dock, looked every bit the part of the accused. He was a schoolteacher, quiet, respectable, yet, here he was, charged with the brutal murder of Sir Geoffrey Poton. The case was unfolding with unnerving speed, every step moving with the certainty of a ticking clock, and the pressure on Grayson mounted with each passing moment. Mr. Arkell Lennox, the sharp-eyed silver-haired barrister for the Crown, stood up with practiced grace, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Members of the jury, the case before you is simple. A man is dead, and a schoolteacher stands accused with motive, opportunity, and evidence that cannot be ignored. His words settled over the room like a heavy shroud, suffocating any hope of doubt. As the trial progressed, Emily Carter, the maid from Poton Manor, took the stand, her face pale, and her hands trembling as she spoke. She recalled the events of that night with a nervous falter, her voice unsteady as she described the strange visit of Mr. Grayson. I remember thinking it odd, she said. He never called at that hour, but I thought nothing of it. Later, I passed the study, and I thought I heard raised voices. Her eyes flickered to the accused, then quickly away, a silent confession of her unease. Lennox pressed her gently. You mean to say you overheard an argument? She nodded reluctantly, the weight of her words hanging in the air, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom, as if the very walls were leaning in, listening for the truth. All the while, Miss Marple sat quietly in the back, her expression unchanged, but her mind working at a pace that none could match. The puzzle was unfolding, and she could already feel the twists and turns waiting to be uncovered. The trial was no simple matter, and she knew the truth was far from what it appeared. The gallery fell into a thick, expectant silence as Lennox, the Crown's counsel, allowed his question to settle in the air. Did you recognize any of the voices? He asked, his tone smooth and calculating. Emily Carter, the maid, fidgeted in the witness box, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I wasn't sure, sir, she stammered. Lennox's smile was thin, almost patronizing. Come now, Miss Carter, surely you would recognize Sir Geoffrey's voice, having worked for him all these years. Emily hesitated, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I recognized Sir Geoffrey's voice. Lennox pressed further, his eyes sharp. And the other voice, was it Mr. Grayson's? There was a long pause, one that stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally Emily lowered her gaze, resigned. I think so, sir, she murmured, her words heavy with reluctant admission. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The next witness, Tobias Pratt, the retired watchmaker, took the stand with a sense of relish, his chest puffed out beneath his garish checkered waistcoat. Lennox regarded him with an air of polite detachment. Mr. Pratt, he began, his voice smooth like velvet, please tell the court what you heard on the evening of the murder. Mr. Pratt cleared his throat with great importance. Well, sir, he began, I was just locking up my shop when I saw Mr. Grayson walking toward Poton Manor. I thought it odd, him coming at such a late hour. He's not one for late visits, you see. Then just a short while later, I heard shouting, loud voices, angry voices. I couldn't make out all the words, but I did hear Sir Geoffrey say something about not getting away with it, and something about ruining him. The court rippled with excitement at the mention of such damning words. Lennox turned slightly toward the jury, as though to silently say, there you see. He turned back to Mr. Pratt. And did you recognize the other voice? Pratt hesitated, his face twitching with uncertainty. "Well, no, sir, not exactly," he stammered. Lennox's eyebrow arched in silent disbelief. "Not exactly." It was muffled, sir, but it was a man's voice, sounded agitated. Lennox leaned forward, his voice laced with tension. "And you assumed it was Mr. Grayson?" Mr. Pratt, now clearly uncomfortable, nodded. "Well, yes. Who else would it be?" In the back, Albert's defense counsel, Mr. Darlington, a man more eager to please than competent, mumbled an attempt to undermine the testimonies, but the damage was done. The pieces of the puzzle had been set. Emily Carter had seen Albert Grayson enter the manor. Mr. Pratt had heard an argument, with Sir Geoffrey's accusations still echoing in the air, and the murder weapon bore Grayson's fingerprints. Circumstantial evidence, yes, but undeniably damning. The jury was gone for less than an hour before returning, their faces grim and unyielding. The foreman, a ruddy-faced farmer, stood up and cleared his throat. "We find the defendant, Albert Grayson, guilty of murder." A collective breath was drawn, sharp and full of disbelief. Albert for the first time sagged under the weight of the words, his fingers gripping the wooden railing in front of him. The judge, a stern figure, whose spectacles glinted in the light, adjusted them with a deliberate motion before speaking in measured tones. "Albert Grayson, you have been found guilty of the murder of Sir Geoffrey Putton. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out 7 days from today. May God have mercy on your soul." A cold, terrible silence swept over the court. Even the air seemed to freeze. Miss Marple, who had remained an unwavering presence throughout the proceedings, did not flinch. Her knitting, once so methodical, lay forgotten in her lap as she gazed forward, her expression unchanged. Outside the courthouse, the sky was an oppressive gray, stretching endlessly over the rooftops of the village. Mrs. Finch, ever the gossip, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Well, it's done. Poor Mr. Grayson," she murmured, a hint of satisfaction beneath her sorrow. "But what can one do?" Miss Marple's hands, folded neatly over her handbag, gave a small, thoughtful smile. "One can always do something," she murmured softly, her voice laced with a quiet resolve. She turned away from the crowd, stepping toward the waiting carriage with deliberate purpose. After all, Albert Grayson was innocent, and Miss Marple intended to prove it. The air around the courthouse felt thick with tension, the weight of the verdict pressing down upon the assembled villagers like the calm before a storm. The oak-paneled walls seemed to close in as the judge's final words echoed in the silence. "You are sentenced to death by hanging." The words hung heavy in the air, almost unbearable in their finality. Albert, his face pale and drawn, barely moved as the verdict was read. His hands, trembling slightly, gripped the railing in front of him, but his eyes remained fixed, unfocused, as though he were already lost in thought, somewhere far beyond the judgment of the court. Miss Marple watched him intently, her sharp blue eyes reflecting a deeper understanding of the truth that no one else could yet see. At the corner of his mouth, Albert exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire room. The whispers in the gallery began to swell, rising like a tide as the enormity of the sentence sank in. 7 days, just 7 days, no years of appeals, no drawn-out delays, just a swift, unrelenting finality that settled heavily over the courtroom. The judge gathered his papers with deliberate precision, the sound of rustling parchment punctuating the grim silence that had fallen. The guards, moving with quiet efficiency, approached the dock, and the trial, with all its drama, its false accusations, its tangled testimonies, was over. Albert's gaze lifted, steady and unnervingly calm, as he scanned the sea of faces in the gallery. For the briefest of moments, his eyes met those of Miss Agatha Marple, sitting quietly in the back. She did not flinch, did not look away, as if she too understood something that no one else in the room could. By the time the villagers returned to St. Mary Mead, the verdict had transformed from a mere fact to an almost mythical legend. The once tranquil streets, with their gentle rattle of carts and the occasional murmur of conversation, now hummed with eager speculation. At the Fox and Hound, The usual discussions of weather and church affairs were discarded, replaced entirely by fervent debates over Albert Grayson's guilt. "I never would have thought it," Mrs. Harrison, a stout woman known for her sweeping pronouncements, declared, her voice thick with disbelief. "Albert Grayson, a murderer, fingerprints don't lie." Mr. Needham, the butcher, nodded sagely, his brow furrowed in agreement. "Arguing with a man the very night he turns up dead. Might as well have signed his own confession." Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, sipped her tea thoughtfully, her lips pursed. "I must say, I always found Mr. Grayson rather distant. Not unkind, but distant, like he carried some great burden on his shoulders." "Well," Needham said, shaking his head, "it'll be the noose for him come Friday." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like the toll of a bell. A few seats away, Miss Marple stirred, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she added a single lump of sugar to her tea. "Fingerprints don't lie," she murmured, her voice soft, almost absent. "But people do." Needham frowned, unsure of whether to be offended. "Miss Marple, you're not suggesting the jury got it wrong, are you?" "Oh, not at all," she replied, her tone pleasantly neutral. "Juries are very good at following the facts they are given. The difficulty I find is ensuring they have the right facts in the first place." A curious silence followed her words, and she let it linger just long enough before taking another sip of tea, her expression unreadable. By the time Miss Marple returned to her modest cottage, the night had fully settled over St. Mary Mead. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking time as it passed relentlessly, as it always did. She removed her hat and placed it carefully on the stand, but did not immediately light the lamp. Instead, she stood for a long moment at the window, gazing out over the dimly lit streets, her sharp blue eyes narrowing, as though seeking something just out of reach. Something was wrong, not wrong in an obvious way, no glaring contradiction, no missing evidence that would send the case into turmoil. No, it was something more subtle, something too neat, too convenient. Albert Grayson had been convicted on 3 crucial points: motive, he had argued with Sir Geoffrey; opportunity, he had been seen entering the manor, but no one saw him leave; and physical evidence, his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. All of it was damning, all of it perfectly arranged. And that, Miss Marple thought, was precisely the problem: too tidy, too conclusive. She sat in her favorite chair, folded her hands in her lap, and let her mind wander back over the trial. Emily Carter's testimony, Mr. Pratt's recollection of the argument, the fingerprints on the candlestick. It was all too convenient. Albert Grayson, a man known for his mild, bookish nature, for his meticulousness, he would have been careful, and yet his fingerprints had been found so clearly, so perfectly placed on the weapon. A curious thing indeed. She reached for her knitting basket, her fingers moving instinctively over the familiar wool. "Now, Agatha," she murmured to herself, her voice soft with determination, "let's see who else might have had a reason to wish Sir Geoffrey dead." She would begin in the morning. 7 days wasn't a long time, but she thought it would be enough. The Emford prison, where Albert was to be held, was a grim place. A squat grey stone building with thick iron-barred windows that let in little light, and even less warmth. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and resignation, the kind of place where time seemed to have no meaning, where it collected like dust in the corners. Miss Agatha Marple, small and unassuming in her well-pressed tweed coat, stepped into the visitor's room, her eyes sharp and calculating. The clock was ticking, and Miss Marple had only 7 days to unravel the truth. Miss Marple entered the chamber with a look of mild interest, as if she had simply arrived early for tea. Her sharp, observant eyes scanned the room, taking in the grim surroundings with the same quiet curiosity she reserved for any puzzle. The stout guard, his face permanently creased with a scowl, led her toward the heavy wooden door that separated the convicted from the free. "You've got 15 minutes, he grunted, unlocking the door with an audible clunk, and stepping aside. Miss Marple nodded politely, the faintest smile curling her lips. I shouldn't think I'll need more than that. Beyond the door, sitting stiffly on a narrow bench, was Albert Grayson, the man who had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in what felt like the blink of an eye. He was thinner than she remembered, his spectacles crooked on his nose, the weight of his circumstances apparent in the haggard set of his features. He looked up as she entered, and for a fleeting moment, relief flickered across his face, only to be replaced by something more guarded. Miss Marple, he said, his voice hoarse but steady, this is unexpected. She took the seat opposite him, folding her hands neatly over her handbag, her expression unchanging. Yes, well, she said pleasantly, I thought it was high time I had a proper conversation with you. It seems a great many people have been speaking about you, Mr. Grayson, but very few have taken the trouble to speak to you. Albert gave a small humorless smile. I don't imagine there's much point now. The jury's made their decision. Juries are very efficient creatures, Miss Marple replied in her usual mild way, but efficiency and correctness are not always the same thing, wouldn't you agree? Albert studied her for a moment, then gave a slight, almost reluctant nod. Tell me, Mr. Grayson, she continued, her tone light but her gaze unwavering, about the night of the murder. I should very much like to hear it from you. Albert exhaled, running a hand over his hollowed-out features, the wariness in his eyes deepening. There isn't much to tell, he said at last. I left my cottage a little before 8. I'd written a letter to Sir Geoffrey, nothing contentious, just an appeal, I suppose. Miss Marple prompted gently. He was planning to evict you. Yes, Albert chuckled bitterly. I thought I might reason with him, put my case on paper since the man didn't care to listen when I spoke. So you walked to the manor, slipped the letter under the door of his study, and left. Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly over her handbag. That's right, and you did not enter the study? Miss Marple asked, her tone calm, but probing. I did not, Albert replied. And yet the prosecution claims your fingerprints were on the murder weapon. Albert's hands tightened into fists on the table, a flash of frustration crossing his face. I cannot explain that, Miss Marple. I only know that I never so much as touched it. A small pause settled between them, long enough for a thought to take root in Miss Marple's mind. And this letter of yours, Mr. Grayson, she continued, her voice steady, what became of it? Albert shook his head, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. It should have been found in the study, but when the police searched the room, it wasn't there. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, a subtle flicker of intrigue crossing her face. How very odd. Albert let out a slow breath, his voice tinged with a mixture of resignation and bitterness. Inspector Crack believes I never wrote it at all, that it's a fabrication, an attempt to explain my presence at the house that night. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she reached into her handbag, and withdrew a small folded square of paper. Albert's brow furrowed in confusion. What's that? Miss Marple unfolded it with delicate precision, revealing a list of things that seemed unusual. Just a little list of my own making, she said softly, a record, you might say, of things that don't quite add up. Albert leaned forward, curiosity overtaking his despair. Go on. Firstly, Miss Marple began, her tone calm but unyielding, if you did indeed leave a letter under the door, then someone must have removed it before the police arrived. Albert's eyes widened slightly, his face paling. Secondly, Miss Marple continued, your fingerprints on the murder weapon, they are very tidy. Albert echoed, his confusion deepening. Oh yes, Miss Marple nodded, her voice almost too sweet, perfectly clear, perfectly damning. But a man like yourself, Mr. Grayson, a careful man, a school teacher accustomed to order, doesn't seem the sort to handle a brass candlestick so indiscreetly, does he? Albert's mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Miss Marple smiled sweetly, her gaze steady. Which leads me to my third point. If someone took the trouble to remove your letter, and if the fingerprints were, let's say, too convenient, then I must ask myself, who benefits from your conviction? Albert sat back, the first flicker of something like hope crossing his face. "You believe me," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Oh, my dear Mr. Grayson, it does not matter what I believe," she said softly. "It matters only what I can prove." She glanced at the clock on the wall, then rose to her feet, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt with practiced elegance. 7 days, she said quietly. 7 days is all I have, but I believe it will be enough. Miss Marple adjusted her hat as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, her mind already weaving together the threads of the case. 7 days is quite a lot of time, if one knows how to use it properly, she murmured to herself, the words hanging in the cool, autumn-breathed air. With that she turned and left the precincts of the village, her steps purposeful, though to the casual observer, she appeared as if on an ordinary walk. The scent of damp earth and fallen leaves filled the air, the quiet serenity of early autumn belying the storm of whispers that swirled through St. Mary Me. In the greengrocer's shop, at the post office, even in the muted hush of the parish church, the murder of Sir Geoffrey Peyton remained the subject of every conversation. "I always said he had a queer look about him," declared Mrs. Harrison, arranging a neat row of cabbages outside her husband's shop. "Not in an unkind way, of course. Very light man, but the quiet ones are the ones you must watch." Mr. Needham, the butcher, who had appointed himself an expert on matters of justice, nodded solemnly. "It's the evidence, see? His fingerprints were on the candlestick. That sort of thing speaks for itself." Miss Marple, standing quietly by a display of apples, did not interject. She merely smiled, handed over her coins, and departed. And yet, as she made her way back toward the modest warmth of her cottage, her thoughts were already far from the village's chatter. The evidence had spoken, yes, but had it told the truth? Seated comfortably in her parlor by the crackling hearth, Miss Marple reached for her knitting basket, not because she had any intention of knitting, but because the rhythmic action helped her think. Albert Grayson had sworn without hesitation that he had never touched the murder weapon, yet the brass candlestick, its heavy base stained with Sir Geoffrey's blood, had borne his fingerprints, clear, incriminating. Too clear, perhaps. Miss Marple paused, her fingers hovering over the soft wool. It was a strange thing, was it not? A man would grip a candlestick so firmly, then leave it behind in such an obvious manner. If Albert had been foolish enough to strike Sir Geoffrey in a moment of rage, surely he would have wiped it clean, or at the very least dropped it in haste, with no time to leave pristine marks. But the fingerprints had been perfect, too perfect, as if placed there deliberately. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, a small gleam of satisfaction in her eye. That, she thought, was something worth exploring. That afternoon, under the guise of a polite social call, Miss Marple visited Emily Carter, the maid who had testified against Albert Grayson. Emily lived in a modest cottage just beyond the village green, a neat, comfortable place for a woman in service. The door was opened by Emily herself, a young woman with anxious eyes and a pale complexion, who quickly smiled when she saw her visitor. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, smoothing her apron with unnecessary care. "Yes, Miss Marple," she added, almost too quickly, "what a dreadful business, isn't it? The trial, all those terrible questions." Miss Marple's smile was kind but probing. "One can hardly blame you for being quite out of sorts," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "It's not easy to witness such things, and worse still to have them dragged up before the entire village, is it?" Emily hesitated, then nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "It has been rather awful," she confessed. Miss Marple settled herself into the small, tidy sitting room, taking in the modest furnishings, the lace curtains drawn neatly across the windows, giving the room a sense of tranquility that seemed almost at odds with the storm of emotions swirling in Emily's eyes. "You must be very brave," Miss Marple remarked softly, "to have spoken so clearly at the trial. Such a terrible thing to witness, of course, seeing Mr. Grayson enter the house that night. I mean. Emily swallowed, her voice cracking slightly. I only told the truth, Miss Marple, she said, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple nodded gently, though her blue eyes twinkled with a sharpness that Emily failed to notice. Oh, naturally, dear, Miss Marple said, her tone soft but insistent. But if I might ask, you said you saw him through the study window, did you not? Emily nodded a little too quickly, her eyes darting to the side. Yes, I was outside, near the garden path, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Ah yes, she said, thoughtfully, such a difficult angle, isn't it? Emily's fingers twitched in her lap, and a flush spread across her pale cheeks. I beg your pardon, she stammered. Miss Marple folded her hands primly, her voice becoming almost too polite. The study windows are quite high, dear, and face the back garden. If I remember correctly, from the side garden one wouldn't have a very clear view inside at all, certainly not clear enough to identify a person so definitively. A long heavy silence settled over the room. Emily's throat bobbed as she struggled to maintain her composure, her nervousness palpable. Oh, she whispered, her voice cracking, I suppose I might have been mistaken about where I was standing. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gleaming with an understanding that made Emily feel suddenly small. Of course, dear, she said, sweetly, the words hanging in the air like a delicate web waiting to trap a fly. Quite understandable, Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost a whisper, as she studied Emily with a gentle but knowing gaze. Memories can be so troublesome, can't they? One can be so certain of something one day, and then, well, the next it all becomes a little muddled. Emily forced a smile, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap, but the tension in her shoulders and the slight twitch of her fingers betrayed the unease that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed everything, the way Emily's breath caught slightly when she spoke, the way her eyes darted just a little too quickly when the subject of the trial came up. I shan't trouble you further, my dear, Miss Marple continued, rising from her chair with deliberate grace, adjusting her gloves with an almost exaggerated slowness. It's always such a pleasure to see you, but do take care with what you remember. People are so quick to believe what they hear, aren't they? Her words hung in the air like a subtle threat, delicate but sharp, as Miss Marple stepped out into the cool afternoon. The smile that had been so carefully placed on her lips faded, replaced by a gleam of quiet calculation in her eyes. She had seen it, the slight tremor in Emily's hands, the barely perceptible flicker of panic that danced behind the maid's calm expression. Emily Carter had lied, and Miss Marple found that fact very interesting indeed. As Miss Marple walked through the village, the cool breeze carrying with it the scent of freshly turned earth and the fading warmth of autumn, her thoughts turned back to the case. There was something peculiar about the dead, she mused, something almost mystical. In life, a man might be disliked, even feared, but the moment he is murdered, he acquires a certain nobility, a kind of tragic grandeur that hadn't been there before. It was certainly the case with Sir Geoffrey Peyton, at least among those who had never met him. To those who had known him, his tenants, the business associates he had betrayed, the relatives he had treated with such open disdain, his death was greeted with everything from muted surprise to a quiet, almost satisfied relief. Sitting in the corner of the Fox and Hound later that afternoon, Miss Marple listened intently as Mr. Caleb Norris, the village solicitor, recounted the financial troubles that had plagued Sir Geoffrey's estate. His words were slow and deliberate, as if to emphasize the complexity of the situation. Complicated, yes, Norris murmured, stirring his tea absently. And not to mention, highly disagreeable. Miss Marple smiled politely, her gaze unwavering as she allowed him to continue. He was rather unpopular, wasn't he? She asked, her voice light but cutting, probing for more. Norris let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any real amusement. My dear Miss Marple, I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I don't think I've ever known a man who had quite so many people actively awaiting his demise." Miss Marple's smile remained, though inwardly she felt a small thrill of satisfaction. "How interesting," she murmured, leaning slightly forward, her hands folded in her lap. Norris sighed, shaking his head. "Let's begin with Henry Peyton, shall we? The nephew." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, feigning mild curiosity. "Ah yes, the one who was, shall we say, disappointed by the will," she suggested, her voice soft coaxing. Norris chuckled dryly. "More like outraged," he corrected. "Henry was meant to inherit the estate. It was always expected. His extravagant tastes, his bad investments, debts he could never pay off. But then," he paused, leaning forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "the will changed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, the sound a pleasant contrast to the building tension. "And what did the new will entail?" she asked, her tone still light, but with an edge that made Norris hesitate before continuing. "Sir Geoffrey cut him off entirely," Norris said with a small frown, lowering his voice even further. "Disinherited him completely." Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-motion, her mind racing to piece together the implications of what she had just heard. "Dramatic, indeed," she murmured. Norris nodded, his eyes flickering with a mix of professional detachment and something darker. "The new will left the bulk of the estate to charity, with the remainder going to—" He trailed off, clearly reluctant to finish. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. "To whom?" she prompted. Norris sighed, as though burdened by the weight of the secret he was about to reveal. "Emily Carter," he said, the name slipping from his lips like a reluctant confession. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but inwardly, her mind raced. Emily Carter, the same maid whose testimony had helped convict Albert Grayson, was now linked to Sir Geoffrey's death, not only through her testimony, but through the inheritance of his estate. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but surely, and Henry of course contested the will, even before the murder, Norris continued, claimed his uncle had been manipulated. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on Norris as she absorbed every word. "And the will, was it ever executed?" she asked casually. Though her mind was far from casual, Norris shook his head, still in probate, which means, in the event of Sir Geoffrey's sudden passing, the previous will, naming Henry as heir, would likely remain valid. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once again, the rhythm steady and deliberate. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself, her thoughts darkening with the weight of new revelations. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the home of Mr. Tobias Finch, a retired banker, who had once been a business associate of Sir Geoffrey. Finch, however, made it clear that he had not been entirely pleased with his association with the late baronet. The two sat in Finch's study, a room lined with shelves of leather-bound books, the faint scent of old paper and pipe smoke clinging to the air. "A shrewd man, Sir Geoffrey," Finch began, his voice cool and precise. "And a greedy one." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her tone measured. "Oh dear, that is rather a dreadful combination, isn't it?" Finch snorted, clearly in agreement. "He had enemies everywhere," Finch continued, his voice growing sharper. "Business rivals, former partners, investors who had been ruined by his dealings. He was exceptionally skilled at making money, at the expense of others." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze piercing. "Had any of these people, had any of them reason to harm him?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Former associates, Mr. Finch murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Threatened Sir Geoffrey recently. There was Roland Vassar, a French financier. Sir Geoffrey had swindled him out of a